it fits in because this is what mass, broad, kind of aggressive, untrammeled mass deportation looks like. There's other reports about how far the administration is going. For example, a 4-year-old from Mexico who may have difficulty or lack of access to what is believed to be a life-saving treatment because the family's legal status was revoked. Outrage over 2 high school students detained by ICE. Again, are minors who aren't breaking any other criminal law the priority? And a poll shows a majority of voters now, having let it sunk in for 130 days, think Trump's immigration
see. One day later, day after the Court of International Trade, what was his basic rationale?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite similar. He essentially ended up saying that the president's actions, because IUPA itself, as we alluded to when we talked about the jurisdictional question, does not provide for the assessment of tariffs at all by the president, then his executive orders were ultra virus, meaning outside the law, and have to be enjoined. He says, I don't have to get to issues like whether Congress delegated too much, right, in violation of the non-delegation doctrine or principles of non-delegation, because just as a matter of the statute and the text of IUPA, it doesn't give him this authority. Therefore, did I have jurisdiction, right, to make that ruling? He, the president, did not have authority to issue tariffs. Full stop. The end.
Exactly. The key phrase the court agrees with plaintiffs that the power to regulate is not the power to tax. As Chief Justice Marshall put it in an early leading case, quote, the power to regulate commerce is entirely distinct from the right to levy taxes and imposts, unquote. So that, obviously a great sight. We'll see when it gets to the Supreme Court, what they do with Chief Justice Marshall. By the way, that's going back to our founding. That is not Thurgood Marshall. That is the earlier Marshall.
One last point on this is one other big difference between Judge Contreras' opinion. In that case, it was brought by two companies, and his ruling applies only to those two companies. The Court of International Trade ruling was more back on this idea of a universal injunction. They're saying these tariffs are enjoined, period, everywhere across the country.
Yeah, and I love the fact that the lead plaintiff, by the way, is a fine importer. He's so sort of dear to my heart.
Yes, of course.
So I did a little data on this, which is we're not going to go back over the January 6th pardons on day one, but I just want to give the sense of the numbers here, which is by far Donald Trump has issued, if you look at pardons and commutations, I'll discuss for in a second what the difference is. By far, if you add up the first and second term, he has issued more pardons and commutations than any other president. Pardons are sort of getting rid of the whole case, the whole criminal case, since it doesn't apply to civil cases, it doesn't apply to state cases. The commutation can be where you've served your 2 years that you were supposed to serve 8 years, and your sentence is commuted. So it doesn't get rid of the guilty finding or the sentence down, but it commutes the sentence. The person who comes close to that is, and I thought it was a most framing for the discussion, is President Obama, who issued a number of commutations, and that the reason I think it's useful is because that was based on a change in the law and the sentencing guidelines related to drug calculations, where people likely would have received a very, very different sentence had they been sentenced under the current law. And so he set up an entire robust process with a lot of requirements in order to receive that clemency. You had to have served a certain amount of time. You had to have had good conduct. You had needed to not have significant criminal history. You had to be a non-violent person. And all of that went through the pardon attorney. It all went through DOJ processes. There was a lot of procedure and process to make sure that people were being treated equally and fairly with clear standards. And so when you look at the numbers of commutations, President Obama has a lot more commutations, but under this process. What President Trump has is what, as you said, appears to be, I'm not going to say all, because that's certainly not the case, but it seems like a lot of these cases are without any process at all. Obviously, the huge group is the January 6th cases, but, I can relate it to my prior life working on the Mueller investigation. Paul Manafort, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, George Papadopoulos, all pardoned. Indeed, almost everybody who did not cooperate but was convicted was pardoned.
So, yes, to all that. And
Speed camera ahead.
So, yes, to all that. I lived those Obama pardons at the end of his term when every day with a whole stack of folders from the pardon attorneys to go over case by case the many people who were serving really, really long sentences for drug crimes, non-violent drug crimes, that, you know, under the former sentencings before Congress sort of relaxed these a little bit, and the sentencing guidelines were getting really, in some ways, draconian sentences, and so a lot of care put into those. What we're seeing here seems to be in multiple different categories. There are sort of the white-collar criminals who it seems like Trump is pardoning with this theory that they were unfairly prosecuted. Sometimes they were the victims of a weaponized system. And sometimes it's celebrities, sometimes it's former government officials. People may be familiar with the Chrisleys. They apparently had some sort of reality TV show and they were convicted of fraud.
You're not watching that, Mary?
I'm not personally familiar.
You're not a reality. You strike me as a reality TV person.
I'm sure that's shocking to know that I don't watch that or didn't watch that. But they were convicted of bilking banks out of tens of millions of dollars in 2022. They got sentences of 12 years for Todd Chrisley and 7 years for his wife after a jury found them guilty of fraud and tax evasion and conspiracy to defraud. But, you know, they have now been pardoned. Now, notably, I believe one of their children, one of their daughters, an adult child, had been very involved in sort of lobbying the president and people in the president's orbit for this pardon.
Yeah, and so the other is, to your point, that it's important to remember with respect to the Chrisleys, as they were just listing that example. One, the case was brought by a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney.
Yes.
Two, the case was upheld by the 11th Circuit on appeal. Three, the accountant who was convicted along with them is still there, like his conviction stands. So if you really thought this was just weaponization,
right.
One, it was your own U.S. attorney, but two, what about the other person who's clearly a lesser player? And this seems like all of those facts would, let's just say, they are, just put it in the terms of what we used to do, it's evidentiary of something else is going on here unrelated to the merits, and would support the idea that this is transactional. Obviously, there are lots of other examples of people who have given money to Donald Trump.
Or people in their families, right?
We're either, the money is either coming directly or indirectly and going to not directly to Trump, but to Trump-related things like, you know, institutions or PACs. And so that is the phenomenon that is like, I mean, unfortunately, the pardon power is so capacious.
That's right.
That all there really needs to be is some sort of arguable good faith reason. But this is why any normal administration, Republican or Democrat, has processes in place. But I just want to make one point about, to be fair, we have seen abuses of the pardon power in other administrations, Democratic and Republican. And many people would point to Joe Biden as an example of that. And certainly,
the administration currently is definitely pointing to Joe Biden, so that he basically changed the waterfront in pardons when he pardoned his son and then pardoned
his family.
His family. That's right.
But there's no suggestion that it's random and higgledy-piggledy based on money that's being given. But Bill Clinton there's a real concern about Mark Rich.
That's right.
And what was done there. This is, is steeped in, as a law-abiding citizen, as somebody who's in the Justice Department, as a defense lawyer, where I'm concerned about fairness and so that your client is being treated the same as anyone else.
And will have a fair shot. And it wouldn't feel that way to someone who does not have the connections or the financial wherewithal to be able to get to the White House. It would feel like they're just stuck.
And to be really fancy in my thinking, two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah.
What kind of principle is that?
Before we move on, I just want to, one thing, I want to take us back to the immunity decision, right? Because you're right, and the Supreme Court has reiterated it last summer, that the pardon power, it is exclusive to the president. It is right there in the Constitution, and it is capacious.
And there's this very interesting issue where this is like, welcome to being law professors, which is if you had a bribe for a pardon, there's an argument that the pardon would still be effective.
True.
But
Yes.
the bribe could be prosecuted, both the person paying it and the person receiving it, which seems like, crazy.
Yeah.
But I just want to just also point out, I don't want people to think that what we're saying is that Donald Trump has used them in any way consonant with Bill Clinton or Joe Biden. Here's just a rough list of some political corruption cases where people have been pardoned or received commutations. John Rowland, the Connecticut governor; Rod Blagojevich for selling a Senate seat; Chris Collins, a Republican member of Congress; Duncan Hunter, another member of Congress; Randy Duke Cunningham; Brian Kelsey. All of those are political corruption cases, and there are more. White collar, so many. I already talked about the many cases from the Mueller investigation: Bernie Kerik, Mike Milken, Ellie Weinstein, the Chrisleys that you mentioned, Trevor Milton, Maud Zuberi, apologies if I'm mispronouncing it, and then Paul, is it Walziak, whose mother allegedly gave lots of money just before the pardon was issued. And then there are a lot of violent criminals who've also been pardoned.
This is so interesting to me. Like the head of a major drug trafficking ring.
Exactly.
He was convicted not only of trafficking offenses, but murders, right?
Yeah,
This is
exactly. Larry Hoover. Crazy.
in Chicago, the Gangster Disciples. Now, apparently, the artist who now goes by Ye, who used to be known as Kanye West, apparently this was a big deal to him that Mr. Hoover be pardoned. But it seems fairly inconsistent with the president's purported wanting to crack down on drug trafficking, right? I mean, he's invoking drug trafficking as a reason for tariffs.
And just to continue the sort of hypocrisy, there are major healthcare, I'm going to use the term criminals because they were convicted, but major healthcare convictions that were overturned in the first and second terms of Donald Trump. One is Philippus Formus in Florida. That was a fraud section case that was done with the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office. Major fraud. I mean, that's supposed to be a big priority for Donald Trump, is healthcare fraud. And again, that's the same thing that is happening in this term. So there's a real inconsistency. And the reason, Mary, you and I wanted to talk about this is this guts the justice system. If you have a president who's saying we're only going to prosecute people who are disfavored and enemies, and we're going to use the pardon power to get our friends out, or as Ed Martin, who is now the new pardon attorney, has said in discussing this, his quote, which is from a tweet, is "no MAGA left behind." That is the quiet part out loud. I mean, that is shamelessness.
Yeah. And I believe that was with respect to the pardon of a former sheriff in Culpeper County, Virginia, who had been convicted of accepting over $75,000 in bribes in return for appointing a bunch of Virginia businessmen as auxiliary deputy sheriffs. Bribes, cash payments, and payments toward his election campaign. He was just sentenced in March by the Trump Justice Department to 10 years in prison with a press release by the Trump Justice Department. Now, his prosecution would occur before that, but he was sentenced, right, during the Trump administration only 2 months ago.
Right. And
already has been pardoned, with the comments by Ed Martin, the newly appointed pardon attorney, saying no MAGA left behind, and Trump saying that this former sheriff had been, quote, dragged through hell by a corrupt and weaponized, unquote, Justice Department during the Biden administration. Interestingly, when his own Justice Department then went in and advocated for this sentence.
Exactly. And this is Scott Jenkins is the name of the defendant who received that pardon. Another example of sort of public corruption. I mean, you sort of have to sit there and say, gee, what is Trump getting at where he's aiming pardons at public corruption? Those are cases that, Mary, you and I, when we were in the Justice Department, had special significance. It's like crimes involving civil rights crimes where they so undermine sort of who we are as a people and our trust in government. And so that's where those public officials should be held to a higher standard, not a lower standard.
We want to have faith that our government works for us and not just engages in self-interest.
Exactly. And it shouldn't be like if you're a Republican who engaged in crime, you're going to be out scot-free, but that there's a lot of that what is going on. And we really wanted to take time out to focus everyone's attention on what is happening. It is a prime example of lawlessness. We've talked about it in so many other contexts. We've talked so much about what's going on in the immigration context, and that with the court saying what's violation of due process, what is a violation of a statute. But this is core also, and even though it can be lawful to issue a pardon, it doesn't mean that this is good policy and that this is not leading to lawlessness in the way that if you tell people, no MAGA left behind, what is the message to politicians and people who think, I have a get out of jail free card and it just requires a certain amount of money or a certain affiliation with a certain party.
Yeah. And that's a perfect transition to our break and our next topic, because as we talk about changes in the FBI, the reporting that is recent has said that in recent weeks, the FBI disbanded the Washington field office's elite federal public corruption squad, which was best known for investigating Mr. Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, among other sensitive inquiries involving prominent government officials. That is reporting by New York Times reporter Adam Goldman, and we will come back to that after the break.
MSNBC's Jen Psaki, host of The Briefing.
We've never experienced a moment like this in our country, and it leaves us all with a choice. Are we going to speak out, or are we going to be pressured into silence? I've worked for presidents. I've faced the tough questions from the press and even threats from the Kremlin. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't cower to bullies. We don't need to be hopeless. We have our voices, and I will continue using mine.
The Briefing with Jen Psaki, Tuesday through Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC.
Welcome back. Well, as we were just ending the last segment talking about some of the moves, let's say, and changes within the FBI, one goes directly to the point you were making about pardons, Andrew, which is taking emphasis away from public corruption. That's just one of the changes within the FBI, and that fits really well, I think, with things that we talked about episodes ago regarding changes made within the department itself, the Department of Justice.
Absolutely, and this is one where I want to make sure people understand that this may fit very well in the idea of elections have consequences, but it doesn't mean that the policies you have to agree with. And so if you're getting rid of one of the leading public corruption squads, it's right to ask why. Like, for
Yes.
what? What is the other priority? Now, it is fair. You could imagine someone going, well, our priority is going to be fentanyl. I mean, by the way, good luck telling me this is like that you're doing more than Ann Milgram, who is the head of the DEA, and how much they did on fentanyl. But
Yes.
if you're going to focus on the fentanyl problem, great, if that's where you think resources are. But it's hard to view the article about getting rid of this group not in conjunction with our last conversation about pardons for people who engaged in public corruption. Rob Blagojevich, selling a Senate seat is what he was not only accused of, but convicted of. And by the way, many of the people who got pardons didn't go to trial. They pled guilty.
Right.
They said it out of their own mouth. And so I wanted to focus on one thing that I thought in this article that was in the New York Times that you were referring to with Adam Goldman, which I thought was sort of interesting, which was it was reported that many of the people who were being asked to sort of leave or step down or be reassigned were senior women.
Female agents, that's right.
So obviously I was at the FBI as the general counsel. There are wonderful, wonderful female agents and female analysts and obviously female lawyers that I work with. But in terms of proportion, it is striking compared to like the U.S. Attorney's Office, the dearth of women in leadership. It was something that when I was there working for Robert Mueller, he was very focused on that because for him, and by the way, he was a Republican, DEI and diversity was something that was important and was not a bad word. And I just want to make sure people understand it is also critical to the mission and the success to have a diverse workforce, particularly in law enforcement, where some of this is making sure that you can talk to communities, that they have trust. And so there's a whole variety of reasons. But I thought that was an indication of the sort of anti-DEI that we're seeing outside of, in the world writ large, at least reportedly having an effect in the Bureau. And that is not a place where, let's just say, white men don't really have a problem in being represented.
Yeah. I can attest to that as well, having worked with the Bureau for decades. Yes.
Mary, can I tell you one quick anecdote?
Sure.
When I got to the Bureau the first time, I called a friend of mine who was an Asian American woman, and I said, wow, it's pretty, like, it's a little surprising. We show up at a meeting and it's a lot of white shirts and white men.
That's right.
And she said, Andrew, in Washington, you are the diversity.
Right. Yeah, oh gosh, that's pretty resonant. And I think there's another important point about this, which is a couple of things I think are happening. There are these ultimatums, and the reporting is that a number of these senior female agents were given an ultimatum: take a different post or be asked to retire. So if you retire because you've been, suggested that you go to take some position you're not interested in taking. An example here was a senior agent who had been in charge of intelligence at the Los Angeles field office, was asked to relocate to a Huntsville, Alabama office where she would take on fewer responsibilities, or she could retire, right? This is also a way to avoid doing an actual firing and to sort of avoid getting more review. Now, review of firings in the FBI is already highly circumscribed, and I think that's something that people
about that.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. Mary, turn it over. Why is the FBI different than sort of your normal DOJ attorney? Because remember, the FBI is part of the Department of Justice, but different rules.
That's right. The FBI, like other parts of the intelligence and national security community, are exempt from the Civil Service Reform Act. That's the law that allows for protections for federal employees from being fired without cause, without having, committed some misconduct. And also it provides an adjudicative procedure for even if you are accused of misconduct or something like that, that would be cause for firing. But FBI, as well as many in the intelligence community, are exempt from that. So they cannot, if they're fired, go and file a claim under the CSRA or take that appeal up to the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. There are some internal procedures all within the FBI to appeal, a firing or even just any discipline, but it's all internal to the FBI. And one thing I was reading yesterday is the Inspector General's report from just a couple of years ago, looking at discipline within the FBI and finding that there are these procedures, and there are various ways these procedures should be appealed, even though, again, they're still limited to the FBI. So if at the end of the day, things go to the director, and the director says, nope, this person's out, you're still out, you can't appeal this anywhere, with one little caveat I'll come back to. But one of the things the Inspector General pointed out was a large number of the firings are these summary firings that are not provided for in the procedures at all, the internal procedures. So there's no criteria for when there can be a summary dismissal. People who've been summarily dismissed have been told there is no appeal even under the internal procedures. And one of the things that the Inspector General recommended is that if you're going to have a summary dismissal, then you need to say what people can be summarily dismissed for and what process they have to contest that. Because right now, you can imagine the misuse of that. Because even if you have a bunch of internal procedures, if there's this thing, a summary dismissal, which apparently originated in a 1996 or 1997 memo from former Director Louis Freeh, and isn't otherwise memorialized anywhere other than a newsletter from a few years ago that referred to Louis Freeh's memo, nobody even knows that they could be subject to that summary dismissal. So why do I say all this? I say all this because that means a whole lot of stuff can go on within the Bureau by a director and deputy director who wants to kind of clean house, first of all, without really the public knowing and without giving these people a real chance to make arguments about why the discipline against them is unfounded. The caveat, the asterisk, is constitutional claims, right?
Right.
So when I was thinking about the ultimatums given to these women, do they even know that it's happening to others to be in a position to think, hey, this might actually be an unconstitutional, equal protection violation that we could actually make a case on. And I'm not saying there is or there isn't, but by doing it in this way, it's even
Somerset.